Bye. So I'm going to go ahead and dive in and get started, because really what we want to hear is what Kristen McCallie is going to be sharing with us in just a few minutes from the Children's Advocacy Center. But before we get to that, there are some things that I wanted to share with everyone on the call about the happenings going on in our beloved State House, she says facetiously. So here are some updates. To start with, I'm just going to go big and go happy. Yesterday, the really horrible marriage bill that was rolling back protections against forced and coerced marriage, and well, not with the amendment child marriage, thankfully, but the really horrible marriage bill that we've been fighting for the last 4 years was rolled to summer study in a House subcommittee, which essentially means it has been stalled for this year. It also means that everyone fully intends for it to come back again next year. So we will be fighting against things to roll back protections on child marriage and forced and coerced marriage for the 5th year in a row next year. But it's still good news because it's over for this year, barring something extraordinary, and that is amazing. The other thing I wanted to share, because I know this is an issue that's been particularly salient here in Chattanooga with our Mayor's Council for Women and some other partners, is that the anti-shackling bill that prohibits shackling of pregnant incarcerated persons is finally on committee calendars to be heard this coming week. So, and it will definitely be heard in subcommittee on Tuesday. It will be one of the bills that we include in our action alert that goes out Monday. And I just really want to stress to make sure that we make some calls on that. In the less good news category, the bill that we've supported now in 2 different sessions for childcare funds for candidates failed in subcommittee again. This bill, for a reminder or to refresh the memories of some of you, simply stated that campaigns running for, or individuals running for public office, candidates could use campaign funds to pay for childcare when it was directly related to campaign activity. We've supported this multiple times. It failed in subcommittee. I really thought we'd get it at least to committee. We did not. And then for those of you who receive our action alerts, you'll remember that a couple weeks ago, we included a request for action from Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. They're a partner organization, lots of great friends. They had asked us to support, and we did, their bill for extreme risk order protections, which basically meant that if someone was a risk to themselves or others, and there was evidence of this, that their firearms would be temporarily removed from them. So if someone, for example, were talking about suicide and was in possession of guns and was reported by a family member or a professional, that then there would be able to be an extreme risk order protection issued so that then they would not have access to firearms. That bill also failed in subcommittee. I was speaking with Linda, who's one of the volunteers who coordinates their work. It will be back again next year as well, but it's been a rough week. In terms of things like that, failing in subcommittee and not even having real conversations in our House. So that's sort of the update. No child marriage, no forced marriage, at least for another year, but lots of things that we're going to have to continue fighting as we continue to move forward. But that is not why we are here today. As most of you know, every year on our priority list, we spend a lot of energy trying to find the bills that really support survivors, support victims, support advocates. And this is something that almost all of our partners, both locally and across the state, also prioritize when we're working on women's issues. And that's because when we're talking about survivors and victims, we are often talking about women and children, and that is what we are working for. And so today, those are the bills that we're focusing on. We're going to talk about 4 of our priority bills that address these special populations. I'm going to hand off to Kristen McCallie, who's going to talk to all of us about the Children's Advocacy Center of Hamilton County. CAC is a great partner of the Women's Fund. They do amazing work. They're a former Nightingale grant recipient. We love them. And really, we need to lift up the work that they're doing, particularly now, to make sure that they continue to be able to do it and to protect children and families to the best of their ability. And then Kristen will hand back to me, and because it's me, we'll make sure that you all get some action items and things that you can do right now today to start making a difference, because we don't want to talk about these things without giving you a chance to know that you are using your voice to do great things about them. So that's our agenda. I think it will be pretty fun. And of course, if we have time at the end, I will answer questions, but I'm going to go ahead and say we're going to move through these bills first and get to Kristen before I open it up for questions, because you all know I talk a lot. So I'm going to talk about 4 bills today. One of them is one of our priority bills. I'm calling this Let's Fight Trafficking Before It Starts. And our bill has already passed the Senate, and we are now going on week 4 in the K through 12 subcommittee with it. Super thrilled about that. But this is a really simple bill. It states that everyone in a school, not just teachers, but everyone working in a public school, needs to be educated about recognizing the signs of human trafficking and knowing how to intervene, particularly in trafficking of children. We know factually that this has been an issue in our part of the state in the last 5 years. We know that it's been an issue far west from some of our partner organizations near Memphis, that it's been an issue there. In short, we need to make sure everyone on the front line who has the opportunity to see students at school, whether it's just see them coming and going like a school bus driver, whether it's in a classroom, whether it's as a paraprofessional, as a coach, whoever it is needs to be able to recognize these signs, know how to intervene, and know what to do. Because we also know that there have been trafficking situations in schools that have been witnessed by people who weren't trained, and it took them a lot longer than it should have to know the proper course of action. So this bill, it's number 13 on the calendar this Tuesday in committee. So I think we'll get to it this week. Last week, we just didn't get to it because of some other debate. It'll be there. There is an amendment on the bill. It's not a great amendment, but at this point, we just want to get it through the House. If it passes the House with an amendment on it, there was not an amendment in the Senate, then we will strategically talk to Senator Gardenhire about whether or not we want to challenge and remove the House amendment from it. So that's one of our bills. We are trying to get ahead of trafficking. I'm all for bills that are about consequences and penalties for traffickers, but I'd much rather see bills that stop it before it starts. And this, I'm going to call this Let's Give Victims a Real Chance to Get Help. So often we don't talk about protecting people and protecting people's healing and protecting victims' rights beyond prosecution. So first, we're opposing this bill. It's House Bill 2575, Senate Bill 2476. So last year, we worked in coalition with a lot of groups to stop a bill that said no one can anonymously report child abuse. So if you report child abuse, you have to reveal your identity, which is horrible in every way, because most people who report abuse are also in situations of risk. So to take away their right to report anonymously means that they are putting themselves, their loved ones, possibly their jobs at greater risk. This year, the same sponsors came back with this bill that says, okay, fine, people can report anonymously, but you can't begin an investigation based on an anonymous report. So you can report anonymously, but we can't do anything about it. This passed subcommittee. The problem is in subcommittee, honestly, the conversation was framed in such a way that it was kind of missing the point. We've had some meetings. We have some partners that are going to have some meetings with some people heading into full committee in the House, but we really feel like the best possibility to stop this is going to be in the Senate. And it is moving into Senate Judiciary this coming week. And so we have some phone calls and some Zooms actually over the next 2 days to speak to some senators on judiciary. But essentially anyone reporting abuse should also be protected. We want to protect reporters, because if we don't do that, how will we ever protect children? And Kristen might want to add to that, but that's another bill that's on our priority list. In general, we're always going to prioritize bills that are going to get people help sooner. It's just good practice. The next bill is Awake's Advocate Confidentiality Bill. We've been fighting for this bill for 3 years. I will lift it up every single chance that I get because it's so important. Essentially what this says is that if a victim speaks to an advocate, meaning, and it's defined in the bill as a trained advocate. So whether this is at a rape crisis center, a family justice center, a domestic abuse shelter, if they go in and speak to a trained advocate, then that conversation and that communication is privileged, and the advocate cannot share everything that a victim shared with them without the victim's permission. Because we know that if victims think people are going to talk about what they have shared, then they just won't talk. If they can't get help and protect their privacy, they won't get help. And so this is really important. There is an amendment forthcoming on this bill. It's a good amendment. It basically just reordered the sections of the bill and changed the language around basically what results in extreme risk if, the advocate would have the right to talk to law enforcement if, for example, they were speaking to the victim and they thought that the victim was in immediate life-threatening danger. And so there was some change in that language within the bill, but it's a positive amendment. So if you happen to see it when it goes to committee, it's not on calendar yet. It's going to be on the final calendar. And you hear about an amendment, it is a good amendment and one that everyone has worked on to see go into effect. And the fourth bill that I want to just lift up, and this is going to relate to our action item for today, is a bill that eliminates a barrier facing survivors of trafficking. Those of you who have been involved with the Women's Fund for a long time, actually not that long, like 4 years, would remember that we wrote and passed a bill that allowed survivors of trafficking to have their nonviolent criminal records expunged, because most individuals who are trafficked end up with a laundry list of criminal offenses that are on their records as a result of what their trafficker made them do. One of the concessions that we had to make when we passed this bill was there were some legislators in the House Criminal Justice Subcommittee who are still on that subcommittee who insisted that prostitution be one of the offenses on the list. So we will allow this to go through. We will expunge their entire records as long as one of the offenses is prostitution. But the problem with that is all trafficking isn't sex trafficking, right? We don't talk about sex trafficking. We talk about human trafficking because we don't know if that person is being used to run drugs. We don't know if that person is being sex trafficked. We don't know if that person is being used for other illicit things. What we do know is that person has no control over what is happening to them. So this year, there's a bill that removes, all it does is remove the language requiring that one of the offenses be or one of the convictions be for prostitution. I am nervous because some of the members of the Criminal Justice Subcommittee who will be hearing this bill are the very same people who required that that clause be built into it 4 years ago. So when we get to action items, we'll talk more about that. But in short, we need to remove the stigma that all trafficking is sex trafficking. And we need to allow people who escape being a victim and become a survivor the easiest pathway to starting their lives. And maybe they were sex trafficked, but maybe that's just not what they got arrested for. It doesn't matter. They still deserve to have this chance at a life once they get out of it. So those are 4 bills. They are all moving right now, except for a Wakes bill, but it is calendared for final calendar. So you'll be hearing about all of those in forthcoming emails from me, and then later on this call. But what I really want to do, and what I've been waiting for, is to hand over this meeting to Kristen so that you can talk to us about the Children's Advocacy Center in general, to make sure everyone knows the amazing work you do, and then also specifically about some of the things that we should know so that we can help your work do even more. So I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to hand over to Kristen.
Thank you. And thank you to the Women's Fund and the staff for giving us this opportunity to have this conversation today. I want to express gratitude for the support, both through the Nightingale Fund and as well as just being an excellent partner in this legislative journey that the Women's Fund has offered our organization and the kids that we serve. So I also want to acknowledge on the call is our Director of Intervention Services, Stacy Cook. So all the really hard forensic interview and medical stuff that I'm going to talk about, she oversees that entire team and has been with the organization for almost 20 years. She's amazing. So just, I know she doesn't, she's like, stop. So part of what I want to do today, like Janine said, is just to talk generally about what the CAC does, and then some connections to the Bill 2575. And I believe we had our chapter meeting for the Children's Advocacy Centers of State of Tennessee, and there was also some destruction of record language put in that bill that is really awful, like potentially the anonymity piece of the bill is bad, but this destruction of records piece that was just added onto it is also really terrible. That if there is an anonymous call in and it's not substantiated or investigated, that they just destroy the record. And that's problematic for a lot of reasons. And I'll talk through all those things as well. And so I know, same. What my goal today is to provide you all with some information, but also for you to ask questions when you have them. I feel like that's more useful than me just, telling you about our organization. I just want to make sure that everybody knows that you can just interrupt. You can put in the chat any questions that you have as we start to talk. But there are about 40 or so CACs across the state of Tennessee, and we are divided by judicial districts. So we cover the 11th judicial district. And the reason for that is because we are statutorily mandated through Tennessee Code 371607, which is the Child Protective Investigation Team statute, that we're also doing some amending to this year through our state organization to include some new language around medical providers. But we come together to provide intervention and therapeutic services for children who are alleged victims of sexual abuse. And I am going to speak about sexual abuse, just to trigger warning folks. I'm not going to speak explicitly about case, but just want to put that out. And I know child advocacy doesn't necessarily mean a straight line to sexual violence, but just wanted to put that in a space as well. And so we cover Hamilton County, which is the 11th Judicial District, and work closely statutorily through that TCA code with all law enforcement in Hamilton County, the Department of Children's Services, the District Attorney's Office, Erlanger Children's Hospital, and our own mental health forensic interview and medical teams and therapists internally as well. And so our goal is to create a pathway for kids who are alleged victims so that they have a space to tell what's happened to them in a place that's protected, and also being able to use as evidence to be entered in a criminal investigation, and to provide resources and referrals for the non-offending caregivers for that family, because we all know sexual violence is a very complicated topic, and families don't just come to us dealing with what's in front of them. They might have a host of things that they're trying to deal with as well. Everything we do is at no charge to the family, And we see anywhere between 600 and 700 kids annually through all of our services. And when we talk about sexual violence, we know for every one case that's reported, national statistics tell us that there are about 5 to 7 that are never reported. So we know our numbers are for kids who have come forward or to speak to an adult. And that's the other reason with that DCS bill that is so terrible is that when we get calls, the only way a child can see us is if the Department of Children's Services gets a severe physical or sexual abuse call, law enforcement makes a referral, or the district attorney can also make a referral. About 90% of our cases come through DCS. So, and when we talk about volume, Hamilton County over the last calendar year had 622 severe cases, and we saw all of them. Drug exposed, sexual violence, and physical abuse, because our database is connected to the DCS database. So we can see, what comes in as severe. And that partnership with DCS is incredibly important. And one of the things that our organization prides ourselves on, and within our child protective investigation team has a good reputation on, is the way we collect data. And data is going to be really important as we continue this conversation. I'm a data person. I feel like that takes the emotion out of what this issue is and really speaks to how this impacts, but also the data for particularly prosecution is really important in this community. And we're going to talk about that today. So when a child comes to see us, they likely will get a forensic interview. A forensic interview is a conversation between a trained professional and that child. And the statute, there's a forensic interview statute that dictates both education, ongoing and prior, that person has to have to even be in front of the child. And it's recorded on a closed circuit TV, and in another room, law enforcement and DCS observe, and they're the folks that are assigned to the case. So when something comes through our database, it's assigned to one of our folks, and then the law enforcement jurisdiction where it happened is assigned, and then a DCS worker is assigned to it. So there's like 3 main veins to think about when we talk about case staffing. So the forensic interview happens, and we don't do forensic interviews on kids younger than 3, just because it's, that's our practice. And our forensic interviews can be 5 minutes, they can be 2 hours. It really depends on the length and severity of what that child experienced and where they are in their trauma journey about how much they want to share. And that is recorded and can be entered in as evidence if there is a prosecution down the line, if the child is younger than 12. And we'll talk through those pieces as we get there. We also have an on-site sexual assault pediatric nurse practitioner, and she does a head-to-toe exam of kids as deemed by policy. So not every kid gets a medical. I'd say between 300 and 400 of those 700 kids get a medical, and there are some kids that get medical onlys as well. And that medical exam, she can ask more direct questions. Our forensic interviewers don't ask leading questions because that would never hold up in court, number one, and that's just not the method. And our medical exams, really, we get a ton of delayed disclosures. So a kid will be abused when they're in elementary school, not disclosed till middle school, and that's when they come to see us. And there's no statute of limitations of when a child can come to see us. There might be statute of limitations, of course, on when it can be prosecuted, but certainly we would see a kid regardless. If there is something that has happened, we will see them. And because they're delayed disclosures, the physical evidence around these cases is very lean, unfortunately. And so we don't do a lot of rape kits here. We do have a memorandum of understanding with Erlinger. So if there's an emergency that comes through the ER and there's a sexual assault exam that's done on a child, we share, our nurse practitioner can view the records and we can share that information, and that will come to play later when I talk about our child protective investigation team. And so those are the 2 arms when a kid comes in that they will get for intervention. The non-offending caregiver sits with our family advocate, and they are provided with whatever resources and referrals they need. Sometimes it's, de-escalation, just understanding process, because they think, oh, are you guys going to take our kids away? Can you arrest this person tomorrow? There's a ton of questions that parents and guardians come to us with. And so that advocate just sort of helps them understand the process And it's a lot of messaging and understanding. We do both community advocacy and systems advocacy, right? The community advocacy is that referral piece that we do with our advocates, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about in the next bit is really that systems advocacy piece. That includes this legislation discussion as well. So that happens, and child can be referred for therapy. Therapy is an important arm of what we do here. We have all licensed clinicians that provide trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, or TFCBT, and our therapy is as long as that family needs at no charge. And we do have a component within our therapy, if appropriate, for the family to be involved as well. I'm going to take a breath and take a sip of my water and see if anybody has any questions. If that's all clear, if you guys are good, you can give me an emoji or see.
I'm going to sit on my questions, all 3 of them that I've written down.
Okay.
But we do have another bill we have to talk about when you're done.
Okay. 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 All right. So the meat and potatoes of what I wanted to talk with you all about today is our Child Protective Investigation team. And Stacy staffs that. She works very closely with the DCS workers, our law enforcement folks, and the district attorney's office. And so after a case goes through the process of having a forensic, a medical, the family's received advocacy, and they may have been referred for therapy, it comes to a case staffing. It happens every other Wednesday for between 4 and 6 hours, and we have this docket. It's all the cases that have come through. And at that table are the folks I've already mentioned, plus juvenile court. And then the district attorney sends an assistant district attorney to staff. And this becomes important as we continue the conversation. They all come to the table and we have a case review and a process where prior history is given and everybody sort of talks about what their portion in the case was. Our forensic interviewers read the disclosure guide. Our medical person provides what we know medically. If there's any case history with juvenile court, that is shared. So that comes together because it's not DCS's meeting, but it's something we facilitate for DCS, because in that meeting, we decide beyond the child's story if there's enough information to substantiate. And if a case is substantiated, what that means in that context with SIPIT, that person is an alleged offender and they're put on the DCS registry. So that's the first part. And this is where it gets a little, I have to make sure I don't get in the weeds too much. So when we talk about substantiation, that happens. And I want to go to my statistics. So in the calendar year 2021, there were 761 cases presented to SIPIT and 106 of them were substantiated. So if we talk about a funnel, the way to think about how this prosecution works, we're going from about 761 to about 100. That's 14%. And there's lots of reasons that things aren't substantiated. We need something beyond the child statement. And I can tell you, I haven't sat in that room as long as Stacy has, but we all sit in that room and know that stuff has happened. We just don't have more evidence beyond what that child's presented to us. And because there's due process for the alleged offenders, as well as a burden of proof if it does go to the place of prosecution, that things might not get substantiated. And this is the physical sign that I can show you guys about how that feels, right? So that happens. After SIPIT, those 106 substantiated cases, law enforcement and the district attorney sort of move to their portion of the case, because law enforcement can have a substantiated case and make a decision not to arrest. And if law enforcement doesn't arrest, then prosecution doesn't happen, right? So of those 106 cases, 61 cases were referred for prosecution and 25 were accepted. I want us to sit with that number for a second.
Does that mean there were 61 arrests?
They were referred, so that would mean that there would have to be some law enforcement intervention. I believe so. And part of what we are looking at in terms of systems advocacy is that in that SIPIT, Stacy and her team do a tremendous job of communicating and keeping track of data. So we know all the things. Our data it's really dependable. But when it leaves SIPIT, it's out of our hands, so to speak. It's law enforcement tracking and the district attorney's office tracking. And we keep communication open, but we're not necessarily part of that next piece. So there's some opportunities that are presenting themselves in the next bit of time around how we can improve this. We're accredited by the National Children's Alliance. They accredit all CACs across the country, and they have sets of standards, there's 10 of them, about how if you are going to be an accredited CAC, you need to function. And they are really making a concerted effort to get CACs, because this is a national problem. The lack of prosecution of these cases is a national problem. And so these standards help move along the way that CACs can sort of work more with law enforcement and DA's office after SIPIT happens. So when we look at how that happens after, the prosecution and all of that communication is not for us to direct. So we're looking for opportunities to enhance communication with both our law enforcement partners and the district attorney's office, because Chattanooga has a prosecution rate of less than 5% of all these crimes. And that is the lowest of all metro areas in the state of Tennessee. So Memphis, Knoxville, and Nashville have a better prosecution rate than we do. And so the question then becomes, why? What do we need to do to improve this? And what actions can be taken? And so when we talk about systems advocacy, a big part of my job is working with the folks that are in leadership in law enforcement in the district attorney's office and saying, okay, we see this barrier. How can we make this better? Because if we are asking children to sit there and bare their souls in these forensic interviews and then nothing comes of it, what is the point? There is some, there's definitely a therapeutic aspect of them having the space to tell their story, but if they're not getting justice, what messages are we sending to our community if you are a perpetrator, that there is not a lot of accountability? And so one of the strategies that other CACs are using across the state and across the country is an assigned prosecutor for child sex crimes. Because there's a couple of things that are different with child sexual abuse than, say, homicides, property crimes, drunk driving, et cetera. There's that emotional aspect of having to work with a victim who might be perceived as unreliable or might have a lot of co-occurring trauma. So they're not going to be, I don't want to say easy, but, so a female DA might help. Well, so I will say the ADA that staffs our SIPIT is in Division 1, and she's a female. And I think when we brought these concerns forth with the DA, because we have to have ongoing conversations about how case staffing is working, we were told that it's not plausible with current leadership to have an assigned child abuse attorney. So I think a solution would be prioritizing staffing and funding to make it possible for this, because this is too important. To have a community where perpetrators aren't held accountable creates a dangerous community and bad outcomes for our children. And 60% of our cases are females, 40% are males. And so we know, like Janine said at the beginning, this is an issue that affects women and men, but we're talking about children and families who may have other things co-occurring and they're not getting justice. So I'm going to open it up for questions. And can clarify any of the stats, because I know I went through them quickly and I get excited when I talk about the statistics. So happy to do that as well.
Are you familiar with what some of the other metropolitan regions' conviction statistics are?
Yes. So I can speak to that. So part of that SIPIT statute is that every DA has to send a letter by the 15th of January to the legislature. And that letter has to include information about SIPIT. That's all it has to include. I know, and we got that jazz hand recorded on TV. I'm glad about that. So some DAs provide some really beautiful data about how many cases are prosecuted, demographic information of victim and perpetrator, if it was a plea deal, if it was a guilty verdict, all this beautiful texture. But some DAs just write a letter and say, we have a DA that staffs SIPIT. and they're being compliant with the legislation. I analyzed all the data for every single judicial jurisdiction and their prosecution rate. And the places that have a much better prosecution rate, they're much less in volume than us. So maybe they have, 59 cases total because they're a small rural center. But they also, the ones that have an assigned child abuse prosecutor, by and far have a much better rate of prosecution. It's a better strategy. Rutherford County has two. Rutherford County, in terms of volume and size to us, is much smaller, and their resources are much smaller, but they have a much better prosecution rate than we do here in Chattanooga. In terms of volume, we are the third or fourth. Memphis is like far above us, but we're pretty even with Nashville and Knoxville in terms of volume. And their prosecution rates are better than ours. Knoxville has a 28% prosecution rate. Memphis has a 38% prosecution rate, which I know doesn't sound, that's still bad, but it's better than less than 5%. So yes, there's data out there. And like Janine just put in the chat, that reporting requirement, there's a lot that can be done there as well. So they're definitely, the DA's race is happening right now. And that's what I can say about that. I'll let Janine speak to what action items might be.
Kristen?
Questions? Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to spend the rest of the day worrying about all those other hundreds of perpetrators that weren't prosecuted. Is there a mark on their record? I mean, hundreds of cases and 25 prosecuted. Are children still protected from those people who didn't suffer repercussions?
So they might be substantiated in DCS, but that only helps if they're trying to work with children. Because when you do a background check, you do a DCS check. And my friend from the Y is shaking her head because that's something that the Y does really well. I think part of what we know to be true about perpetrators is that because the accountability, if they perpetrate, is so minimal, that we see folks hopping from place to place and going to get access to children in different ways. So one of the things our organization does is prevention education for institutions so that they can do appropriate background checks and ask questions during employment if they're going to have access to children. But unfortunately, that's the thing. And these cases are also very emotionally laden, and folks have hesitancy to report. And, there's a lot of nuance that I think some of what would be enhanced if we had one child abuse attorney would be that person would have comfort in the issue and knowledge about how to make charges stick and what kind of charges to use. Because we see things all the way from grooming activity to severe rapes and, child pornography on the internet. Like, there's a whole gamut of things that happen. So unfortunately, yeah. Yep.
Kristen, do you know, and I know I can't imagine there's a way to accurately do this, but what are the accepted, say, percentages of repeat offenders of child abuse? Because it's got to be high, right? I mean,
So that's interesting because we can look at case history, right? When a kid comes to us, both if they have been victimized before, we have access to that, and we have access to if DCS has had prior cases, severe cases with that family. And I can speak from the victim's perspective, right? Like, we know when a child is perpetrated on when they are younger, the likelihood that they're going to be perpetrated on again when they're older increases. And we know that perpetrators, I have one case that's like living right here, that there is a perpetrator who was a caregiver, and a call had been made, but we hadn't had an interview that really showed anything. And then that same family came back, and that happens pretty often. And we don't necessarily, we could look at that to track perpetrators. It's also a resource issue because for us, if we think about what our role is, we serve the victims. Perpetrator tracking, that's law enforcement, that's the district attorney's office. And it's also them having resource bandwidth to say, we know this person, they have a violent history, because that's the other thing, right? Like there's also co-occurring kinds of violence that these folks do. It's not, I mean, child abuse certainly can be their lane, but we've have frequency of violent crimes, et cetera. So that's one of the enhanced communication things that we would love to see with a DA who had really streamlined communication with us, both about progress of case, as well as if there's a known perpetrator, that's something that can be brought to SIPIT when we're staffing a case, right? But it's at this point, it's a resources issue. You want to add anything, Stacy? Okay. Any other questions?
Kristen,
Yes.
I have a question. For if you had an assigned child abuse prosecutor,
Mhm.
does that mean that person can't do any other work? I mean, is there a reason? Does the DA have a reason for not assigning somebody?
So we're being recorded.
And can we unrecord for a second? So
I can answer that diplomatically.
Please go ahead. You do it. That'd be better.
No. It's a question of prioritization. And if that person is assigned to run these cases, that does not mean that if she or he did not have a full caseload, that they could not then also be doing other things in the office. It simply means that if these cases are in front of them, that they are assigned to them. And whether or not there's a good reason, it's an issue of what the district attorney chooses as their priorities.
Yep. Because the other piece that we could explore is a DA, even if it was, I think that there's enough out there that if these cases were looked at and investigated, and really there would be enough of a caseload, but also looking at domestic violence, adult domestic violence and adult sexual assault cases, because there's so much co-occurrence happening too, right? So even if it was a prosecutor that had specialization in, say, like what we cover here at the Family Justice Center, that would be more than what exists right now. And the way that the office currently runs, there's different divisions and different assignments. Just there's over 25 ADAs, and we have one that staffs SIPIT. So if a case does get presented to an ADA, it could get presented to an ADA that has never seen the case before. And that's problematic because they might not have the same level of expertise as the ADA that's currently assigned to our SIPIT team. So it's really problematic. And I believe that there would definitely, both the other piece of SIPIT is that there is this case staffing that we do it's really important. We do so much collaborative work with the Department of Children's Services and law enforcement. Stacy and I do post-training for every Chattanooga Police Department officer, from patrol all the way to the chiefs. Every Monday, we're in front of those folks talking about whatever emerging issues there are related to child sexual abuse. We have that opportunity every year. We train our DCS friends, but there is no training currently that we have with the district attorney right now for any of their folks outside the scope of the one person that comes to SIPIT. And that enhanced training does a lot of things, right? Like it increases their ability to understand the nuances of these cases, but it also builds relationship and builds trust and all those things, so that if there are questions, we're seen as a resource like we are with CPD and Hamilton County Sheriffs, and all the law enforcement response to child sexual abuse is really comprehensive in this community. They do excellent investigations for the most part, and Chattanooga Police Department prioritizes victim safety. And, you know, they have a whole special victims unit that's co-located with us here at the Family Justice Center of cops that just do child abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence, runaways, and kidnappings. That's resources and prioritization from leadership that says this is important. So all the pieces that should be around for prosecution to be successful within the systems exist. And we did a lot of homework to make sure that that was true, because that whole sort of coordinated it's complicated to have all these different entities that have all these different philosophies being singing from the same songbook, but really juvenile court, everyone really works collaboratively.
Kristen, can you envision you and Janine going back to the DA's office if there happens to be a change of hands and asking for a specific prosecutor?
So I will say publicly, the person that is running for DA has stated multiple times on public record that she would assign an assigned child abuse prosecutor and resources to it. So it's possible.
You know, and Carrie, I also want to chime in there and say, you know, regardless of if we have a change in our district attorney's office, I think that there is a real opportunity. I've watched y'all's faces to take what you've learned here today and really start educating the rest of our community. Because with or without a change in who is holding the office, we are going to have to become powerful advocates to get changes in how that office is functioning, because a 4% prosecution rate is unacceptable. And the minute I learned all of this from Kristen, I was like, and let's pony up advocates. We've got some work to do. And I know that you all on this call are going to say the same thing, but you know, the devil you know or the one you don't. I mean, all elections are scary. And so what I say in all of those cases are, it's not about who holds the office, it's about the policies that they implement. And we're really good at communicating about the policies and the changes that we need to see. Kristen is amazing at explaining, as all of you now know, the needs of our community, and the Women's Fund knows how to mobilize advocates. And Carrie, you know some really strong advocates, and you know that, I mean, that's where our next step is.
Other questions? Okay, so Janine, I guess I turn it back to you. Is that what we're doing?
Kristen, thank you for your amazing, important work. I'm not into hero worship, but you're my hero.
Oh, goodness. I always say it's the staff. I just make sure they have what they need to do the things. But thank you. That's kind.
Oh, you all are doing amazing work. And the one thing that really resonates with me is that not enough people know about the work that you're doing and about the necessity of the work that you're doing to make our community as safe as it can be. And so my first challenge, we have 2 action items coming up to close out our meeting, because we always close with action items. This first one is pretty simple. I need you all to commit to sharing with 3 people, pick 3, write their names down, and commit to sharing with them about the Children's Advocacy Center, about the work that they do, and as part of that conversation, why elections like district attorney that so many people don't even really think about and don't really dive into. You know, everybody's so eager to talk about our federal elections. Well, let's talk about what's impacting our community, our children, and our families right here in our backyard, and challenge those people if they have a chance to talk to a candidate to bring this issue up with them, and to write those candidates and say, hey, are you going to prioritize this? To post on their Facebook pages, hey, I just learned these shocking statistics. How are you going to work to improve it? And to do that with every candidate, because whether we have the same district attorney or a different one, it doesn't change the fact that we have to improve this issue. So my first is a really simple challenge. Talk to people who care and who you know will care. And then after you've talked to them, ask them to tell 2 more people. Because the first thing we have to do is raise awareness, and the Women's Fund is going to help do that. That is part of what we as a staff have already committed to doing. And the second call to action is very much what you expect to see from me at these meetings. If you all look in the chat, I have just dropped a link to a document in it. On that document are the contact numbers for the members of the Criminal Justice Subcommittee who will be hearing the expungement legislation to remove the language that requires a conviction for prostitution. And they'll be hearing that bill on Tuesday, I believe, maybe it's Wednesday, this coming week, and to call them and ask them to support it. And let me tell you, the names on this list are purposefully strategic. As I mentioned earlier when we were talking about this, I know that there are people on this committee who do not necessarily support this legislation. So if you're going to only make a couple calls, do it to the people who have asterisks next to their name because they're the leadership. Neither Representative Sexton nor Representative Doggett were involved in the previous conversations. Chairman Curcio absolutely was. If you can make more calls, make them. If they ask if you're a constituent, we don't have Chattanooga representation on the subcommittee, so just be honest and say no, but I don't have representation. This is an important bill. I am affiliated with the organization that pushed it to begin with. And stop. I have found that a lot of people are really responsive to that and they really appreciate it. No one's making calls about this bill. And it's going to be left up to them if we don't really get the word out. And this was our original intention. That prostitution line was amended when we originally wrote the bill 4 years ago. And I can't think of anything that would make all of us who were around working on it 4 years ago happier than to see our original intention met and more people eligible for help. With that call to action, I am going to stop recording